At 74 years old, Eleanor Vance sat at the far end of a mahogany conference table while her 4 children finished the paperwork that would make her homeless. But what those 4 successful entrepreneurs didn't know was that their mother had spent 40 years keeping a secret set of books they never bothered to find. They believed they had burned every record of her labor, but a single copy sat waiting in a dusty registry office they never knew existed. This is the story of how a woman who was left with nothing but a ruin found the one thing her children couldn't take away. If you've ever given everything to people who treated your sacrifice like a debt you owed them, this story is for you. If you've watched the people you raised look at you like an obstacle to their inheritance, if you've ever been told that your age makes you powerless, prepare to witness the moment the truth finally came home. Subscribe now, because the look on Marcus's face when the county clerk opens that ledger is something you cannot afford to miss. The room smelled of expensive leather and the cold, sterile scent of a high-rise office. Marcus, the eldest, sat directly across from Eleanor. He was 48 years old and wore a suit that cost more than Eleanor's first car. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his gold Rolex, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. Julian and Sarah sat to his right, whispering about the valuation of the family home in the city. Chloe, the youngest, was busy on her phone. She was scrolling through a travel website, looking at villas in Tuscany. Eleanor felt the weight of the silver thimble against her chest. It hung from a thin chain beneath her navy cardigan. She reached up and pressed her thumb into the small, engraved ivy leaf on its side. The metal was cool. It was the only thing she had left from her own mother. For 40 years, she had used that thimble to press down the corners of tax forms, payroll ledgers, and partnership agreements. She had built the foundations of 4 different companies from her kitchen table. She remembered the winter Marcus turned 25. He had come to her crying because his landscaping business was failing. Eleanor had spent 3 nights without sleep, restructuring his debt and cold-calling clients from her landline. She didn't ask for a salary. She didn't ask for a share of the business. She had simply been a mother. She did the same for Sarah's boutique, Julian's tech firm, and Chloe's marketing agency. She had been the silent architect of their success. She had been the one who balanced the books when the numbers didn't make sense. Now, those same hands were trembling. She tucked them under the table so her children wouldn't see. She didn't want their pity. She had watched them spend the last hour passing folders back and forth. They spoke about her as if she were a piece of equipment that had finally reached the end of its depreciation schedule. They used words like liquidation and restructuring. They never once used the word home. The attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. He looked at Eleanor with a brief flash of something that might have been sympathy. It was gone before she could be sure. He placed a single blue folder in front of her. It was much thinner than the ones the children held. Inside was the title to a property in the Northern Valley. It was a 1-room schoolhouse that had been in the family for a century. It had no electricity. It had no running water. The roof had partially collapsed during a storm 3 years ago. "This is the fair distribution," Marcus said. He finally looked up, but his eyes stopped at Eleanor's chin. "The city house is too large for you to manage alone, Mum. We're just being realistic. The upkeep is astronomical. This schoolhouse is a clean break. It's peaceful. It's what you always said you wanted." Eleanor knew she had never said she wanted to live in a barn. She looked at Julian, who was nodding in agreement. Sarah was checking her reflection in a compact mirror. None of them looked at the blue folder. They knew exactly what was in it. They knew it was a ruin. They had already divided the $3 million in her husband's investment accounts between the 4 of them. They had claimed that Eleanor was merely a helper and had no legal right to the corporate shares. "I need my records," Eleanor said. Her voice was thin, like old paper. "The ledgers from the kitchen cabinet, the green ones." Sarah laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. "Oh, Mum, we cleared those out yesterday. It was just clutter. Old tax forms from the 90s. We hired a professional shredding service to take care of all the old paperwork. It's better this way. No more living in the past." Eleanor felt a coldness settle into her bones. Every record of her 40 years of work was gone. Every proof that she had funded their startups was a pile of grey dust in a landfill. She looked down at the blue folder. She had $12.84 in her purse. She had a silver thimble around her neck, and she had a key to a building that everyone else had forgotten. She stood up. Her knees ached. A sharp, grinding pain that reminded her she was 74. She didn't wait for them to offer her a ride. She knew they wouldn't. She picked up the blue folder and walked toward the door. The carpet was so thick, it swallowed the sound of her footsteps. "We're doing this for your own good, Mom," Chloe called out from the table. She didn't look up from her phone. "You'll be so much more comfortable there." Eleanor didn't answer. She opened the heavy glass door and stepped out into the hallway. The silence of the office building felt like a weight. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button with her thumb. She could still feel the imprint of the ivy leaf from the thimble. She thought, "I am 74 years old and I am starting over with $12. The math of it was impossible. But as the elevator doors slid shut, Eleanor felt something small and hard flicker inside her. It wasn't anger. It was a memory. She remembered a man named Silas who used to work at the county registry. She remembered the day she had insisted on filing a backup copy of the original family land deed 40 years ago. Her husband had told her she was being paranoid. She had paid the fee anyway. She had used the change from her grocery money. Eleanor Vance walked toward the bus station. The wind in the city was cold and carried the smell of rain and exhaust. She adjusted the strap of her bag. It felt heavy against her shoulder. Inside were her only changes of clothes and the blue folder. She had exactly $12.84 left in her wallet. She knew the bus to the Northern Valley cost $11. That would leave her with $1.84. She didn't think about dinner. She thought about the schoolhouse. Eleanor had been 34 when she married Arthur. He was a man with big dreams and empty pockets. She had been 3 months away from finishing her accounting degree at the university. Arthur said he needed her to help him build the family business first. He said her degree could wait a year. She believed him. She closed her textbooks that night and never opened them again. For 40 years, she sat in the small room off the kitchen. She tracked every penny that came in and every penny that went out of the construction firm. She was the one who spotted the errors in the payroll. She was the one who stayed up until 2 in the morning during tax season. She remembered the Christmas of 1992. The children wanted expensive toys they saw on television. Arthur wanted a new truck for the business so he could look successful to his competitors. Eleanor spent 6 weeks sewing clothes for other families in the neighborhood. She took on extra bookkeeping for the local grocery store. She used that money to buy the toys and the truck. She told her family the money came from a bonus the company had earned. She never told them about the sleepless nights at the sewing machine or the way her eyes burned under the lamp. She just wore her mother's silver thimble and kept working. The thimble was the only thing she kept for herself. It was a small, heavy piece of silver. The ivy leaf engraved on the side was worn smooth by the pressure of her thumb. When the children grew up and started their own ventures, she did the same for them. She was the one who found the tax loophole that saved Marcus's nursery from bankruptcy. She was the one who spent her weekends organizing Julian's messy spreadsheets for his tech firm. She never asked for a title on their boards. She never asked for a salary. She thought her children were her retirement plan. She thought love was a contract that didn't need a signature. She had trusted them because they were her own blood. She had trusted them because she had taught them how to walk and how to speak. She remembered a Tuesday morning 3 months ago. Arthur had been gone for only a week. The house was quiet and felt too large. Marcus and Sarah came over with a box of donuts. They said they were worried about her. They said the city house was full of memories that would only make her sad. They suggested she move somewhere smaller and more manageable. They said they would handle all the legal paperwork so she wouldn't have to worry. Eleanor had smiled at them. She thought they were being kind. She had signed the papers they put in front of her while she drank her tea. She didn't read the fine print. She didn't think she had to read something her own children had prepared. Now she sat on a plastic bench at the station. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. A young woman sat 3 seats away. She was talking on her phone and laughing about a party. Eleanor looked at her own phone. The screen was dark. There were no missed calls from Marcus. There were no texts from Chloe asking if she had arrived safely. They had what they wanted. They had the investment accounts. They had the deed to the city house. They had the commercial property where the nursery stood. They had even taken the antique furniture Arthur had promised her. Eleanor reached into her pocket. She pulled out the silver thimble. She held it up to the light. It was small and looked like a toy, but it was the only thing that hadn't been shredded or sold. It was the only thing that her children hadn't seen as an asset. She felt the sharp pain in her lower back. It was a dull ache that never really went away. She stood up when the bus driver called for the northern route. Her legs felt heavy. She handed over her $11 and watched the driver punch the ticket. The bus driver didn't look at her. He just pointed toward the back. Eleanor walked down the aisle. She found a seat near the window. She watched the city lights fade into the distance as the bus moved into the dark hills. She thought about the schoolhouse. In the valley, it was a building nobody wanted. It was a place for things that were no longer useful to the world. She looked at the $1.84 left in her hand. It wasn't enough for a meal. It wasn't enough for a hotel room. She closed her eyes as the bus hit a pothole. Her head bumped against the cold window. She didn't cry. She didn't have the energy for tears. She just held onto her bag. She thought about the registry office in the valley town. She thought about a man named Silas. He would be an old man now, if he was even still alive. She remembered the day she had insisted on filing a backup copy of the original family land deed 40 years ago. Arthur had told her she was being paranoid. He had told her it was a waste of a filing fee. She had paid the fee anyway. She had used the change from her grocery money. The bus moved deeper into the darkness. Eleanor Vance was 74 years old. She was alone. The rain hit the glass of the 41st floor in flat, heavy sheets. Inside Marcus's corner office, the air was still and smelled of expensive espresso and new carpet. Eleanor sat in a chair made of brushed steel and black leather. It was designed for comfort, but her back felt every inch of the rigid frame. Marcus stood by the window, his back to her. He was checking a notification on his phone. Julian and Sarah sat on the leather sofa, hunched over a laptop. Chloe stood near the door, tapping her heel against the baseboard. "We've looked at the numbers again, Mom," Marcus said. He didn't turn around. With the current market volatility, keeping the estate together just isn't practical. We're being realistic here. Dad would have wanted the businesses to stay in the family, and that means we need to consolidate the capital. Sarah leaned forward and picked up a croissant from a silver tray on the low table. She took a bite, and flakes of buttery pastry fell onto her silk blouse. She brushed them off with a careless flick of her hand. The crumbs landed on Eleanor's charcoal wool sleeve. Sarah didn't notice. She didn't look at her mother's face. She was too busy watching the screen of Julian's laptop. "We're just worried about you," Sarah said, her mouth still half full of pastry. "The city house has 3 flights of stairs. At your age, you can't manage that alone. You'll be so much more comfortable in a place that doesn't require so much work." Eleanor looked at the crumbs on her arm. She didn't brush them away. She watched them settle into the weave of the wool. She thought about the 35 years she had spent cleaning the city house. She thought about the nights she had scrubbed the stairs on her knees. Because Arthur didn't want to pay for a cleaning service. She thought about the office she had built in the small room under those stairs, where she had managed the payroll for every single one of them. "I helped build those businesses," Eleanor said. She kept her voice steady. "I have the records of every loan I personally guaranteed for Marcus. I have the ledger for the boutique's first 3 years. Julian looked up from the laptop. He gave a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Those were informal arrangements, Mom. Family helping family. There's no legal basis for equity. We've checked with the firm's counsel." "Besides," Sarah said, "the shredding service already took the old files from the house. It's better to have a clean slate, don't you think?" Chloe finally stopped tapping her heel. She walked over to the table and picked up a pen. "It's a clean break, Mom. We're not being cruel. We're being practical. You should have planned better for your own retirement instead of putting everything into the company's." The attorney, Mr. Henderson, entered the room. He carried a stack of manila folders. He laid them out across the mahogany table with the precision of a card dealer. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked at the children. He pointed to the lines where they needed to sign. The city house to Marcus, the investment accounts to Julian, the commercial properties to Sarah and Chloe. While they leaned over the table, whispering about tax implications and capital gains, Eleanor received what they called the heritage, a rusted iron key, and a deed for a roofless schoolhouse. In a valley 3 hours away, Marcus turned from the window. He picked up his gold fountain pen and signed his name in a flourish. He looked at the paper, then at Eleanor. "You're not getting nothing," Marcus said. "You're getting a property. It's land, Mom. Real value. Most people your age would be lucky to have a deed in their hand at all." He said it as if he were giving her a gift. He said it with the tone of a man who was proud of his own generosity. He didn't mention the $3 million in the investment account that he had just signed over to himself. He didn't mention that the schoolhouse was currently being used to store moldy hay. Eleanor reached out and took the folder. Her fingers brushed Marcus's hand. He flinched, just a fraction of an inch, as if she was something cold. He stepped back and straightened his tie. He looked at his watch again. "We have a lunch meeting at 1, Mom," Marcus said. "Sarah will call you a car to take you back to the house to get your things. We need the keys to the city property by 5 o'clock. The new owners want to start the renovation on Monday." Eleanor didn't ask who the new owners were. She didn't ask where she was supposed to go with $12.84. She felt the silver thimble hanging from the chain around her neck. She pressed her thumb against it through the fabric of her cardigan. She could feel the tiny ivy leaf. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. She stood up. Her knees made a clicking sound in the quiet office. None of her children moved to help her. They were already back at the laptop, discussing the renovation of the city house. They were planning the new kitchen. They were talking about tearing down the small room under the stairs to make a wine cellar. "I'll take the bus," Eleanor said. She walked toward the door. She didn't look back at the mahogany table or the silver tray of pastries. She didn't look at the children she had raised. She opened the heavy glass door and stepped into the hallway. The click of the door closing behind her was the only goodbye she received. The hallway was empty. The bus doors hissed shut behind her. The taillights disappeared into the fog of the northern valley, leaving only 2 red blurs in the dark. Eleanor stood at the edge of a gravel road. The air here was 10 degrees colder than it had been in the city. It smelled of wet pine and old earth. She pulled her charcoal coat tighter around her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The battery was at 12%. The screen was bright and cold against the darkness. There were no missed calls. There were no messages in the family group chat. The last entry was a photo Sarah had posted an hour ago. It was a picture of a celebratory dinner at a steakhouse. Marcus was holding up a wine glass. Chloe was laughing. Eleanor was not in the photo. She was not mentioned in the caption. She put the phone back in her bag. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her remaining change. She counted it by touch first, then held it up to the faint moonlight. $1.84. It was a handful of copper and nickel. She stared at the coins in her palm. They were the sum total of her life's work. 40 years of bookkeeping. 4 businesses built from nothing. $3 million in her husband's accounts. And she held $1.84. She put the coins back and began to walk. The blue folder was tucked under her arm. The paper was already beginning to curl from the dampness of the valley air. She walked for 2 miles. Her lower back was a dull, throbbing weight. Her sensible black shoes were not made for gravel. Every step sent a sharp jar through her hips. She didn't stop. She followed the directions on the deed. She turned onto a narrow track where the trees met overhead, blocking out the sky. The schoolhouse sat in a clearing. It looked like a ghost. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing the grey, weathered wood beneath. The bell tower was leaning to the left at a dangerous angle. A large oak tree had dropped a heavy limb through the roof of the entryway. It wasn't a home. It was a carcass. Eleanor reached the porch. The wood groaned under her feet. She pulled the rusted iron key from her pocket. It was heavy. It felt like a piece of industrial scrap. She struggled with the lock for 3 minutes. Her fingers were stiff with the cold. They refused to grip the metal. She reached for the chain around her neck and pulled the silver thimble into her palm. She used the hard edge of the thimble to help turn the key. The metal bit into her thumb. Finally, the bolt clicked. She pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with the smell of moldy hay and dry rot. It was pitch black. She reached for her phone to use the flashlight. The beam cut through the dust motes. She saw a pair of yellow eyes, reflecting back at her from the corner of the room. A dog stood up from a pile of old burlap sacks. He was a large, grey-muzzled retriever with a torn ear and a coat the color of wood ash. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just watched her. He moved with the same stiffness in his joints that Eleanor felt in hers. He sniffed the air, then walked slowly across the floorboards. He stopped and rested his heavy head against Eleanor's knee. "I suppose you were left behind too," Eleanor whispered. The dog sighed and leaned his weight against her. He was warm. He was the only warm thing in the valley. Eleanor looked around the room. There was a chalkboard on the far wall. It was covered in decades of dust. There were stacks of rotting hay bales reaching toward the hole in the ceiling. Rain dripped through the gap, hitting a rusted bucket on the floor with a rhythmic thud. She sat down on a wooden crate near the door. She didn't turn on a light. She didn't have a light to turn on. She just sat in the dark with the dog. She thought about the city house with its central heating and its clean white sheets. She thought about her children who were likely sleeping in 500 thread count cotton right now. She was 74 years old. She was in a shed with a stray dog and less than $2. She felt the silver thimble in her pocket. It was small. It was insignificant. But it was hers. She closed her eyes. Eleanor Vance was 74 years old when the morning sun finally broke over the ridge of the northern valley. The light did not bring warmth. It only revealed the true scale of the ruin her children had given her. The schoolhouse was a skeleton of grey wood. The desks were gone. The floor was a graveyard of damp insulation and bird droppings. The dog, whom she had named Gus, was already awake. He sat by the door and watched her. He waited for her to move first. She stood up from her crate. Her knees made a sharp cracking sound that echoed in the empty room. Her lower back was a solid wall of pain. She didn't have a mirror, but she didn't need one to know she looked like a woman who had slept in a barn. She smoothed her charcoal coat and checked her bag. The blue folder was still there. Her $1.84 was still there. She walked out onto the porch. The valley was silent. A thin mist hung over the trees, clinging to the branches like wet wool. She began the walk toward the small town she had seen from the bus window. Gus followed 2 paces behind her. He matched her slow, deliberate stride. The town was a single line of buildings along a 2-lane road. It felt like a place that time had decided to leave alone. There was a general store with a faded green awning that sagged in the middle. Beside it was a small diner with checkered curtains in the windows. A white church with a modest steeple sat at the far end of the road, its paint chalky and peeling. A gas station with 2 rusted pumps stood near the bridge. Eleanor walked toward the general store. A bell chimed as she pushed the heavy wooden door open. The air inside was thick and smelled of wood smoke, peppermint, and old paper. The wooden floorboards were worn smooth in the center of the aisles. A man sat behind the counter. He was approximately 80 years old. He wore a red flannel shirt and heavy glasses that made his eyes look twice their actual size. He was reading a local newspaper and didn't look up when she entered. Eleanor walked to the counter. She felt the weight of her remaining coins in her pocket. She knew she couldn't afford a meal. She hoped she could afford a box of crackers and a bottle of water. "Good morning," Eleanor said. Her voice felt raspy from the cold night air. The man didn't look at her hands. He didn't look at her worn coat. He looked directly at the chain around her neck. He stared at the small silver thimble that hung there. He set his newspaper down on the counter and took off his glasses. He leaned forward and squinted. "Arthur told us you'd come eventually, after he passed," the man said. Eleanor froze. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't mentioned her husband's name. She hadn't even reached for the thimble. "How do you know who I am?" Eleanor asked. The man stood up. He was tall and moved with a slight limp. He walked around the counter and stood in front of her. "Arthur came through here every summer for 20 years. He used to sit right there in that chair by the stove. He talked about a woman with a silver ivy leaf around her neck. He said she was the smartest person he ever knew. He said she was the only reason his business didn't fall apart in the early days." The man reached out a hand. "I'm Silas. I used to be the county clerk before I retired and bought this store. Arthur said if things ever went wrong, you'd end up at the schoolhouse. He said it was the only piece of land the bank couldn't touch." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep her hands from shaking. She thought about her children's words in the office. They had called her an informal helper. They had called her work clutter. But here, in a town she had never visited, her name was already known. "We've been waiting for you, Eleanor," Silas said. He didn't ask her why she was there. He didn't ask where her children were. He walked to the back of the store and returned with a thermos and a paper bag. He set them on the counter. He pushed them toward her. "Coffee is fresh," Silas said. "There's a sandwich in the bag. Don't worry about the money. Your husband paid for your first week of supplies back in 1998. He said you'd be too proud to take charity, so he left a tab open." Eleanor looked at the bag. She looked at Silas. She realized her husband had known his children better than she had. He had known their greed. He had known they would leave her with nothing. He had hidden a safety net in the one place they were too arrogant to look. She reached for the paper bag. The smell of ham and mustard made her stomach ache with hunger. She looked at Silas and gave a small, jerky nod. It was the only thanks she could manage. "The schoolhouse is a mess," Silas said, "but the bones are good. It was built to last. You just have to find the light inside it." Eleanor turned toward the door. Gus was waiting for her on the sidewalk. The dog wagged his tail once when he saw the paper bag. Eleanor felt the silver thimble against her chest. It felt heavier than it had that morning. It felt like a promise. She stepped out into the cold valley air. Eleanor spent the next 3 days moving the rotted hay. She worked in 20-minute intervals because her body would not allow more. Her lower back felt like a hot iron was pressed against her spine. The joints in her fingers were swollen and stiff, making it hard to grip the wooden handle of the pitchfork she had found in the corner. She used a piece of discarded baling twine to tie her mother's silver thimble to her wrist. She was afraid the thin chain would snap while she worked. She scrubbed the floorboards with a bucket of cold water from the creek and a bundle of dried grass. The wood was dark, with decades of grime. Her knees were bruised and purple from kneeling on the hard timber. Every time she stood up, the world turned grey for a moment. She had to lean against the wall and wait for her heart to stop racing. She thought about the city house where she had a motorized vacuum and a walk-in shower. She lived on the bread and ham Silas had given her. She ate small bites to make it last. By the third night, the food was gone. She sat on her wooden crate in the dark. The temperature in the valley had dropped. The wind whistled through the gap in the roof, sounding like a person crying. Gus lay across her feet, his heavy body the only thing keeping the cold from her ankles. She looked at her phone. The battery was at 3%. The screen showed 0 missed calls. There were 0 new messages. The last text was from a pharmacy in the city, reminding her that a prescription was ready for pickup. It was the medication for her blood pressure. She had no way to get it. She had no way to pay for it. She thought, I am 74 years old, and I am out of food. I cannot fix a collapsed roof with $1.84. The math of the situation was too large to look at directly. She felt the weight of the silence in the room. It felt like the walls were slowly moving inward. For a moment, she considered walking back to the road and waiting for a bus. She could go back to the city and sit in Marcus's lobby until he felt enough shame to give her a room. She reached for the silver thimble on her wrist. She pressed her thumb into the engraved ivy leaf. The metal was cold, but it was solid. She remembered her mother's hands. They had been covered in scars from needle pricks, but they had never stopped moving. A small bird, a sparrow with a broken wing, hopped through the gap in the door. It chirped once and began to peck at a stray grain of wheat on the floor. It was small. It was alone. But it was looking for a way to live. Eleanor stood up. The pain in her hips was a sharp, biting cold. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked to the corner of the room and picked up the rusted bucket. I am not dying in a hay barn, she whispered, to the empty room, and I am not going back to beg. She went out into the night to fill the bucket at the creek. On the 4th morning, a mud-splattered green truck pulled into the clearing. Silas climbed out of the driver's side. He was carrying a toolbox and a roll of heavy, clear plastic. He didn't ask for permission to enter. He walked onto the porch and began measuring the hole in the entryway roof. The storm is coming tomorrow, Silas said. He spoke around a pencil held in his teeth. This plastic won't hold forever, but it will keep the floor dry. I brought some shingles left over from the store renovation. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He just started working. He moved with a slow, steady rhythm. He worked like a man who knew that time was something you spent, not something you fought. Why are you helping me, Silas? Eleanor asked. She was standing by the porch rail, holding the silver thimble in her hand. Silas stopped hammering for a second. He looked at her, and his eyes were kind behind the thick lenses. Arthur was a good man, Eleanor, but he was a loud man. You were the one who kept the silence, and in this valley, we respect the people who know how to work in the quiet. He went back to his hammering. The sound of the nails hitting the wood felt like a heartbeat returning to the house. Eleanor went back inside. She picked up her bundle of grass and began to scrub the next section of the floor. The pain was still there, the hunger was still there, but the silence was different now. The rain began to fall late Tuesday afternoon, turning the dust on the schoolhouse floor into a thick, grey paste. Eleanor was on her knees near the old chalkboard, scrubbing at a stubborn circle of black mold. Her breath came in short, shallow hitches. The damp air felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. Every time she reached forward, a sharp bolt of electricity shot from her wrist to her elbow. She reached for the bucket, but her hand slipped. The silver thimble, still tied to her wrist with the baling twine, struck the floorboards with a sharp metallic clink. The sound was hollow. It didn't thud against the heavy timber like the rest of the floor. It rang. Eleanor stopped. She moved her hand and tapped the board again with the silver metal. Clink. She sat back on her heels, ignoring the protest from her hip joints. She used the edge of a flathead screwdriver Silas had left behind to poke at the seam between the boards. The wood was swollen with moisture, but the plank near the wall was shorter than the others. It wasn't nailed down. It was wedged. She jammed the screwdriver into the gap and leaned her weight onto the handle. The wood groaned. With a sharp crack, the board popped upward, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath the joists. Eleanor reached into the hole. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. She pulled out a small tin box wrapped in a heavy, oiled canvas. The canvas smelled of old engine grease and peppermint. Her hands were trembling so violently she had to set the box on the floor before she could open it. She took a long, jagged breath and pressed her thumb against the silver ivy leaf on her wrist. She pried the lid open. Inside was a ledger with a dark green cover. It was identical to the ones her children had shredded in the city, but when she opened the first page, she saw a blue official stamp she didn't recognize. It was a memorandum of partnership. Underneath the title were the names Arthur Vance and Eleanor Vance. She read the first paragraph. She stopped. She closed her eyes, waited 5 seconds, and read it again. The document stated that Eleanor Vance was the primary equity holder of the family holding company. It granted her 51% ownership of all future subsidiaries, including the nursery, the tech firm, and the boutique. It was dated 40 years ago. At the bottom was Arthur's sprawling signature. Beside it was the signature of a witness, Silas Thorne, county clerk. Tucked behind the ledger was a yellowed receipt from the county registry office. It was a filing notification for a silent partnership deed. It proved that a master copy of this agreement had been entered into the public record and sealed in the valley's permanent archives 4 decades ago. Eleanor's throat felt tight, as if she had swallowed a stone. She looked at the paper, then at the empty, raining room. She realized why the children hadn't found this in the city house. Arthur hadn't kept his copy in the kitchen cabinet with the clutter. He had hidden it here. In the one place he knew they would never visit, he had protected her from the very people they had raised together. He knew, Eleanor whispered to the dog. Gus looked up and thumped his tail against the floor. He knew they would try, she said. She stood up, clutching the green book to her chest. She didn't feel the ache in her lower back. She didn't feel the cold dampness of her clothes. She walked to the window and looked out at the grey curtain of rain. The children had burned the copies they could see. They had shredded the history they thought was private. But they hadn't known about the valley. They hadn't known about the silent, official record sitting in a basement 3 miles away. Eleanor reached down and untied the baling twine from her wrist. She slipped the silver thimble back onto the chain around her neck. She felt the weight of it settle against her heart. It wasn't just a trinket anymore. It was the seal of the woman who owned the ground her children stood on. She walked to the door and looked out at the mud. That was when everything changed. The following Monday, Eleanor Vance walked back to the general store with the green ledger tucked inside her coat. At 74 years old, her gait was slow, but her chin was held higher than it had been since the funeral. She found Silas behind the counter, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices and a ledger that looked as if a bird had tracked ink across the pages. He looked up and saw the green book in her hand. He didn't smile, but he set his pen down and stepped aside to let her behind the counter. Eleanor didn't ask for a job. She simply sat on the high wooden stool and began to organize the chaos. She spent 6 hours sorting receipts and balancing the store's accounts. Her fingers, though stiff, moved with the muscle memory of 40 years. She used her silver thimble to press the creases out of the crumpled invoices. By 5 o'clock, the numbers finally made sense. Silas paid her in 2 gallons of white paint, a bundle of cedar shingles, and a bag of groceries that included fresh apples for Gus. The transformation of the schoolhouse began with the glass. Eleanor spent 2 days on a ladder she had borrowed from the church across the road. She used old newspapers and vinegar to scrub 30 years of grime. From the tall, arched windows, she worked until her shoulders felt like they were being pierced by needles. She had to climb down every 20 minutes to let the blood return to her hands. But when the sun finally hit the panes, the light didn't just filter in, it flooded the room. She used a hand sander she had bartered from a passing carpenter to strip the grey, weathered skin from the floorboards. The dust turned her silver hair into a dull mask of wood pulp. She coughed into her sleeve and kept moving the machine in slow, steady circles. Beneath the rot, the heart pine was still red and strong. She polished the wood with linseed oil until it glowed like a copper penny in the afternoon light. By the third week, the smell of moldy hay was gone. It was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of cedar and fresh paint. Eleanor painted the interior walls a soft, creamy white. She used a small brush to detail the molding around the chalkboard. She found the original school bell buried in the mud under the porch. She spent a full morning scrubbing the brass with a handful of sand and salt until the tarnish gave way to a dull gold. The physical labor was a map of her recovery. Each nail she hammered into the porch steps felt like a sentence she was writing back into her own life. She stopped thinking about the city house and the mahogany table. She stopped wondering if Marcus had changed the locks. She focused on the weight of the hammer and the resistance of the wood. Her lower back still ached, and her knees remained swollen, but the pain felt productive now. It was the price of building something that belonged to her. The property began to change its shape. She cleared the vines from the entryway, revealing the date 1894 carved into the stone lintel. She used a salvaged scythe to cut back the tall grass until a path emerged from the road to the porch. She found an old wooden desk in the cellar and hauled it into the main room. She placed it directly under the largest window. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the ridge, Eleanor stood in the center of the room. The floor was clean, the walls were white, the air was still. She watched as a single beam of light came through the glass and hit the brass bell on her desk. The reflection danced across the ceiling in a long, golden band. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a detail her children would have called inefficient. They would have seen only the cost of the paint and the time spent on the brass. Eleanor reached up and touched the silver thimble at her neck. She realized she no longer felt like a woman waiting to die in a barn. She felt like a woman who had finally opened the doors to her own life. To her own life. She sat at the desk and opened the green ledger. She began to draft a letter to a law firm in the city. She didn't use the language of a victim. She used the language of a majority shareholder. Gus lay at her feet and let out a long, contented sigh. Eleanor sat at the heavy oak desk beneath the arched window, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon light. She no longer looked at the blue folder with dread. She looked at it as a ledger of a debt that was about to be called. She didn't feel like a woman who had been discarded. She felt like a woman who had finally been audited and found to be the only one with a positive balance. She stood up and walked to the small wood stove. Silas had helped her install. She set a kettle on the iron plate. The room was silent, but it was a full silence, not the hollow vacuum of the city office. She looked at the empty wooden chair on the other side of the stove. "You were always better at the long game, Arthur," she whispered. She wasn't crying. She was stating a fact. She thought about the 40 years she had spent believing she was the one protecting him. She realized now that they had been protecting each other in different languages. He had used the language of deeds and registries. She had used the language of loyalty and labor. The first visitor arrived on a Thursday morning. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who ran the diner with the checkered curtains. She didn't come with a casserole or a sympathy card. She came with a cardboard box filled with 3 years of disorganized tax records and a desperate look in her eyes. "Silas said you were the one who kept the Vance empire from sinking for 40 years, Mrs. Gable said. She set the box on the porch rail. "The IRS says I owe them. $6,000 I don't have. I can't afford a city accountant." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for a fee. She pointed to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Martha," Eleanor said. "Put the coffee on. I'll need a sharp pencil." They spent 4 hours at the desk. Eleanor's hands didn't shake. She found the 3 missing deductions in the first 20 minutes. She found a filing error from 2 years prior that resulted in a refund, instead of a debt. By noon, Mrs. Gable was breathing again. She left the schoolhouse and returned an hour later with a sturdy rocking chair and a handmade quilt. Word moved through the valley like water through a dry creek. Bed. The following week, a young man named Caleb brought his farm's equipment ledgers. He was followed by the local mechanic and the deacon from the white church. They didn't see a 74-year-old woman in a fraying cardigan. They saw a woman who could make numbers behave. They brought eggs, firewood, and a stack of old books for the shelves she had built. Eleanor began to teach again. Not long division or history, but the language of self-sufficiency. She showed the younger business owners how to track their margins. She taught them how to read a contract before they signed it. She was no longer the silent architect of someone else's success. She was the foundation of the valley's economy. She felt a physical sensation she hadn't known in decades. It started in her solar plexus and moved upward, a warmth that felt like a steady flame. It was the feeling of being essential. It was the feeling of being seen for her mind, not just her utility. The pain in her lower back didn't vanish, but it became a distant noise, something she could ignore because she had work to do. She stopped checking her phone for messages from Marcus or Sarah. The battery had long since died, and she hadn't bothered to find a charger. She didn't need to know what they were doing in the city. She knew exactly what they were doing. They were spending capital they hadn't earned. They were living in a house built on a foundation of shredded paper. One evening, Silas came by with a basket of apples. He sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the ridge. "You've changed the weather in this town, Eleanor," Silas said. Eleanor leaned back in her rocking chair. She reached up and touched the silver thimble. At her neck. "The weather was always here, Silas. I just cleaned the windows so everyone could see it." She looked at the brass bell on her desk. She knew the children would come eventually. She knew the children would come eventually. She knew they would hear about the registry fine from their lawyers. She knew they would drive their expensive cars up the gravel road and use their caring voices to ask for forgiveness. She wasn't afraid of that day. She was looking forward to it. She was whole within herself. 2 black SUVs pulled into the clearing, kicking up a cloud of fine grey dust that settled on the newly painted white porch. Marcus and Sarah stepped out first, followed by Julian and Chloe. They wore designer sunglasses and heavy wool coats that looked out of place against the rustic valley backdrop. They didn't look at the restored windows or the cleared path. They looked at the schoolhouse like it was a line item on a balance sheet. Marcus stepped onto the porch. He didn't wait to be invited. He walked through the door and stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the polished heart pine floors and the brass bell on the desk. He took off his sunglasses and tucked them into his breast pocket. "Mom, we've been looking everywhere for you," Marcus said. His voice was warm and thick, with practiced concern. "We've been so worried. We didn't realize the cell service was so poor out here. We're just being realistic, Mom," Sarah said, stepping in behind him. She didn't look at Eleanor's face. She was staring at the green ledger sitting on the desk. "Living out here alone at 74 is dangerous. We had a long talk, and we realized we might have rushed things in the city." Eleanor didn't stand up. She stayed in her rocking chair by the wood stove. Gus sat at her side, his low growl vibrating against her knee. She reached down and rested her hand on the dog's head. She felt the silver thimble against her chest. It was warm from her skin. "The lawyers called us yesterday, Mom," Julian said. He stayed near the door, his hands in his pockets. "They mentioned a filing in the county registry, something from 40 years ago. They called it a silent partnership deed." Chloe stepped forward and leaned against the edge of Eleanor's desk. 51% is a lot of responsibility for someone your age to manage alone, Mum. It's a legal headache. We're here to help you simplify things." Marcus pulled a new set of manila folders from his leather briefcase. He laid them out on the desk, right next to the green ledger. He didn't look at the work Eleanor had done to the room. He only saw the paper. "We've prepared a new agreement," Marcus said. "We'll buy you out of the schoolhouse for triple its value. We've already picked out a luxury condo in the city with 24-hour medical staff. You just need to sign over the voting rights for the holding company." Eleanor looked at each of them in turn. She saw the same hunger she had seen in the mahogany office. She saw the greed that had made them burn her records. She saw the children she had raised, and for the first time, she felt no obligation to fix their mistakes. "You told me this schoolhouse was a clean break," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet and steady. "You told me I should have planned better for your own retirement." "We were just being practical, Mum," Marcus said. "We didn't know about Dad's side deals. We're not being cruel. We're trying to protect the family legacy." Eleanor stood up. The movement was slow, but she didn't lean on the chair for support. She walked to the desk and picked up the green ledger. She didn't look at the new folders Marcus had brought. She looked directly into his eyes. "You burned the records of my life because you thought they were clutter," Eleanor said. "You gave me this ruin because you thought I was worthless." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor held up her hand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You were wrong about both," she said. The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the water in the creek outside. Sarah looked at Julian. Chloe stepped away from the desk. They saw the shift in her eyes. They saw the woman who had balanced their books for 40 years, and they realized she was no longer working for them. "The registry office has the master copy," Eleanor said. "My lawyers will be in touch on Monday morning regarding the audit of the construction firm's last 5 years of dividends. You should probably find your own counsel." Marcus reached for the folders on the desk. His hands were shaking. He fumbled with the leather latch of his briefcase. He looked at the white walls and the polished floor as if he were seeing them for the first time. "We're your children, Mom," Sarah whispered. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm only taking what I earned. The rest is up to you." She walked to the door and held it open. She didn't offer them tea. She didn't ask about their lives. She waited until the last of them had stepped out onto the porch. The door clicked shut behind them. 1 year after the morning she arrived in the rain, 75-year-old Eleanor Vance sat on her porch and watched the sunrise. The valley was silent and smelled of damp pine. The schoolhouse was no longer a skeleton of grey wood. It was painted a crisp, brilliant white that caught the first light of the day. The roof was whole. The bell tower stood straight and proud against the ridge. Gus lay at her feet. He was older now, but his coat was thick and healthy. He let out a soft huff of breath and closed his eyes. Eleanor reached down and scratched his ears. She felt the strength in her own hands. The swelling in her joints had subsided. She had been taking her medication for months. She had a doctor in the valley who knew her by her first name. She looked at the small garden she had planted near the porch. The first green shoots of ivy were beginning to climb the stone foundation. She reached for the silver thimble hanging from the chain at her neck. She unhooked it and set it on the wooden table beside her coffee. The engraved ivy leaf was bright. It was no longer a hidden secret. It was the mark of her authority. The legal battle in the city was over. The audit had revealed 4 decades of systematic underpayment. Her children had been forced to restructure their companies to satisfy her 51% stake. Marcus had sold the city house to cover the initial settlement. Sarah had stepped down from the boutique board. They didn't call her anymore. They didn't send texts about being realistic. Eleanor picked up her pen. She opened a new ledger. This one wasn't green or blue. It was a simple black book she used to track the grants she was providing for local students. She was the primary benefactor of the Valley's new literacy program. She was no longer building someone else's empire. She was building a legacy for the people who had seen her when she was invisible. She looked at the tall oak tree where the heavy limb had once fallen. The ground underneath was clear. The grass was green and soft. She thought about the man who had hidden a copy of a deed in a tin box 40 years ago. "You were right about the filing fee, Arthur," she whispered to the empty clearing. "It was the best money I ever spent." She went inside to start her day. The late afternoon sun turned the heart pine floors into a sea of liquid gold. Eleanor Vance sat at her oak desk, watching as a young woman from the next town over organized a stack of receipts. The girl was only 22, with ink on her fingers and a look of fierce determination in her eyes. Eleanor didn't tell her what to do. She simply watched the girl's thumb press down on the paper, mimicking the exact movement Eleanor had used for 40 years. Eleanor reached up and touched the silver thimble hanging from the chain at her neck. It was no longer tucked away under a cardigan. It sat openly against her navy blue dress. The ivy leaf caught the light and threw a tiny, sharp reflection against the white wall. She looked at the brass bell on the corner of the desk. She looked at Gus, who was sleeping in a patch of sun by the open door. She thought, "I am 75 years old, and I am finally the architect of my own life." The city was a distant memory of grey glass and mahogany. The children were names on legal documents that her own lawyers managed now. She didn't feel the weight of their betrayal anymore. It had been replaced by the weight of the firewood Silas brought over on Tuesdays. It had been replaced by the warmth of the quilt Martha had made for her. She had traded a life of being useful for a life of being essential. Eleanor Vance had spent 4 decades being the silent foundation of 4 empires. She had been the ink in their pens and the numbers in their bank accounts. But when they tried to erase her, they found that a foundation is the hardest part of a building to destroy. She proved that labor given in love is never truly lost. It is simply waiting for the right light to reveal its true worth. She stood up and walked to the porch. The valley was turning blue as the shadows lengthened. She took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. Her back was straight. Her hands were still. She was no longer waiting for someone to give her permission to exist. She was the school mom of the valley. She was the keeper of the registry. And she was finally home. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt the world tried to shred your history because it was no longer convenient, for them this is your reminder that the truth always keeps a backup copy. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment Eleanor found the hidden ledger in the floorboards, because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. Your value is not a line item that can be liquidated by someone else's greed. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest discovery might be waiting in the very place everyone else told them was worthless. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.